our class that's online. And again, I'll say to those of you online, we would love it when you can come. Are you sure? It's got a green light on it. Should be on if it's green, right? I'm on. Oh, ooh, I'm on, all right. Well, let me try that again. Good morning, class. And I'm glad to see you. And those of you that are online in our class, welcome. I hope that you can come and be with us someday soon, because we would enjoy having you here, and we've got plenty of room for you. You might notice that I'm not Richard Hammonds. He's a bright young lad, but he is out of town today, so I got the nod to come and fill in for him, and so we'll do the best we can, and you help me and I'll help you. We are continuing in our study, as you can see, of Hebrews 11, the Hebrews Hall of Fame, as it's referred to, and you've had a number of lessons already in this particular series, and you've had a variety of teachers, good teachers, to have the class organized, and I appreciate their efforts. And so today we're going to take a look at another section. I don't have a handout for you today, so you're just going to have to pay attention. But just to kind of get our brain warmed up, as we think about Hebrews 11, and we think about the first verse, that sets the tone for us, doesn't it? It says, "Now faith is being sure of what we hope for, and certain of what we do not see." That almost sounds like an oxymoron, because how can be sure for what you hope for? I've hoped for a lot of things over the years, maybe you have too, and I wasn't always sure that I'd get what I hoped for. Then I had somebody say, "Be careful what you hope for, you might get it." And so there's a lot of ways of looking at what you hope for to be sure of what you hope for. And then the last part of that verse, certain of what you do not see. As I look around, some of you have had a lot of experience growing up to where you are. And as you think about your lifespan, were you always certain of what you couldn't see? Were you certain of where your life was going to go? You had dreams, you had goals, you had aspirations, and you were working towards something. And you got there, and then you were working maybe towards something else, and you had some hopes, but you couldn't exactly see. And sometimes, you've ever had the experience where you didn't see it coming? All of a sudden, there it was. And maybe that was a good thing, and many times it is. Wow, I didn't see that coming, but that's good. Or I didn't see that coming, that's not so good. But spiritually, we need to have a faith that allows us to be sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. And as I've thought about that and tried to get that figured out in my mind, being sure of what I hope for, to me, means I'm hoping to be in heaven for an eternity with God and Jesus and everybody else that's there. I hope for that. I'm trying to be as certain as I can be in doing what I can do to do that. And I am certain that there is a heaven. I'm certain there is a God. I'm certain that His Word is here to help us. So as we look about that verse and try to look at it from a spiritual application, that's kind of where I am in trying to work through that particular verse and see how that fits into my life. So as we look at today's lesson, let's see if I've got this thing working. Am I going off? Let's see. I think it's off. Let's try again. I did it? We think we got it. It was working a little while ago, and I was really getting kind of happy about it. No, I don't see a little green light here. I'm having technical difficulties this morning. But there we go. I got it now. Okay. me back up here. There we are. That's where we started. Here's where we're going. If we look at Hebrews 11 down towards the end, this is the focus. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies and was not killed with those who were disobedient. So, as we look at this passage, we're going to see the part about passing through the Red Sea. And we're going to see the conquering of Jericho and revisit that. We're also going to talk a little bit about Rahab the prostitute. And it always amazed me when you look at the Bible and you look at the stories of God's people, not everybody was the kind of person you would think God is choosing and God is using. And we'll talk more about that later because we don't want to get too proud about this thing. But we will be looking at those three examples here. And let's look at this crossing of the Red Sea for a minute. That's actually found in Exodus 14. So if you want to page back to Exodus 14, that's where we find that story about crossing the Red Sea. And as we look at that, Egyptians had courage because they followed Moses and those people, his army, his chariots, and he was hot on their trail. And they had the courage, but they didn't have the faith in God, as compared to the Hebrews who had courage to walk through there, and they also had faith that God would handle it for them. But they did have some doubts. And I'd like to look at a couple passages here to just kind of point that out to us. Oh boy. Well, let's look at chapter 14, verses 10 through 12, just for a minute here. And it says here, and as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Now that doesn't sound like a lot of confidence, does it? But to give them a little room, they're right there up against the Red Sea. They look around, and here comes this army, a huge army, probably one of the best equipped armies in that particular day, with the chariots and the archers and the soldiers and so forth bearing down on them. These people didn't have weapons. They were kind of, as we used to say, a ragtag bunch of people. Can you imagine? They had kids and they had animals and they had their stuff. It's just amazing. And so they had some real doubts. And who are they going to blame? God's man, Moses. As we think about his experience, you got to give Moses a lot of credit because he did have patience with those people. That doesn't mean he didn't get upset with them. And that didn't mean that God didn't get upset with them. But he led them all those years. And what do we know about this group of adults here? Anybody remember the story of what, because of their bickering and their wavering of faith, what God pronounced on them? Anybody remember that part? Just a minute. I'll get my man back there.
I said they would not go into the land of Canaan.
Right. they had bickered so much and had mistrust God and his purpose that he actually told them that they would not get to go into the promised land. Matter of fact, let's look at that just for a minute, because I wanted to compare and contrast these people. If you look at Numbers, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and if you look at Numbers 14, you will find here's where the people are really getting upset with God and with Moses. And they've already passed through the Red Sea. They're waiting to go into the promised land. They've sent the spies out. You remember that story where they sent the 12 spies, and the spies came back. And what was the score on the spies as far as go in and not go in? How many said don't go in because we can't do it? Anybody remember that number? 10. So I left 2 that said we can do it with God's help. Let's go. And so we find in Numbers 14 that the people are upset. We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt, it says. That's a pretty strong turnaround, isn't it? Here's these people that were faithful, glad to get out, across the Red Sea, and all the miracles that they saw. And they get to the point where they are ready to go into the land that God is going to give them. And they say, we should choose a leader, rejecting Moses and Aaron, and go back to Egypt. We'd be better off to be in Egypt than we are here with God and what we will be. So even though they had faith as they faced the Red Sea, that faith tended to waver at times. And that's where we find God saying that I'm going to destroy these people. If you look in chapter 14, we'll not take the time to look at that. And we find old Moses coming back and saying, God, you can't do that. Now, when was the last time you told God he couldn't do something? Anybody want to tell me about that? I'm not seeing any volunteers. Sometimes we may think, God, I think you're on the wrong track here, but I'm not going to tell him that. And so, in effect, they're saying, God, you're not doing the right thing. We need a new leader. And so God says here in this chapter, okay, Moses, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to destroy these people. And in effect, he said, we're going to start over. And Moses pleads and bargains with God. God, you really can't do this. Now, when was the last time you told God he couldn't do something? Oh. But he had the reason. If you do this, these other nations who worship idols will say, look, that God's really not a God at all. Our gods are more powerful than you. And basically Moses says, we got to work with the people we got. And we can do it.
The number of people I'm not sure of that was in the group that crossed the Red Sea with Moses' leadership was quite a large number, though.
Yes, it was.
And there was plenty of evidence and should have been self-confidence between them that, you know, if God can cause a safe passage across the sea, even before that, even, you know, they were closing in. Pharaoh was closing in on them, and God caused a cloud or a sandstorm or something to slow them down so that all that could be affected. Yep. And yet them seeing all of that is a lesson in human nature, I think, that says how easy it is for us to fall back into our old ways. And there was whether it was 500,000 or 1 million or whatever, and that's a large number of people to try to think in your head of following one man anywhere.
And especially through a rough area, we would need an officer in logistics to handle that. And I wouldn't want to be that person. That would be a pretty big job. But just to make that movement, move that. And they had animals, and they had stuff, because they'd gotten stuff from the Egyptians before they left. And so they're out there making their way. So I don't want to badmouth these people, but I'm just saying their faith wavered back and forth. And luckily they had a leader that saw God's purpose. and that was willing to negotiate with God to say, this is what we have, we need to do what we have, and I'll work with them. I'll do what you want me to do, and if you'll help me, we'll get this done. In the back, way in the back here. My man will be there in just 30 seconds. Chop, chop. Boy, no respect.
Something that had never occurred to me before, but listening to you talk about how Moses asked or told God no, it kind of dawned on me that God never had to have any kind of conversation with Moses. Anyway, he's God. If he really wanted to wipe the people out, he would have. I think it was more of an opportunity for us to learn from that example of Moses stepping up as a leader, standing up and saying, listen, you've given me this authority to lead these people. You want me to represent and show what you can do with your people. So he's causing Moses to think and stand up for the commission he's been given in a way. So I think that's kind of an example for all of us, that when you're trying to lead others, especially eldership, a lot of times you have a lot of people in the flock that are going back and forth as to what they want to do or not do, or support or not support. But the elders, have to try to work that out to where they are still glorifying God in all that they do. So I think it's kind of a good example for all of us to look at and think about it from that standpoint.
I appreciate your thoughts. The question is, can we and should we negotiate with God? Is he a God that will negotiate with us? And I would say there may be a yes, a qualified yes there, if we are seeking to do his will, if we're seeking to carry out what he has asked us to do, and we are doing our very best, and we are dialoguing with him, maybe that's a better word, seeking his continued guidance as we've encountered something we hadn't anticipated. And Moses was a good person to do that. I think he had training, best training of his day, and I think his personality was such. But still, that's a pretty big thing to say, God, I think we're making a mistake here. we got to go back and rethink this thing. This gentleman here needs to say something.
I appreciate what Lance brought. Particularly, it's not arguing or negotiating with God in terms of an elder circle decision. It's a discernment made after pleading with God. The best approach is from a prayerful perspective and a listening perspective of what is God really saying, pleading with him that help us for the clarity, the wisdom, and the discernment decisions.
Right. And wouldn't it be nice if our lives was a straight line, was linear for you math people? I don't know too many people that have a linear life. Now, there may be some of you out there, some of you math people figured it out, some of you accountant types. It's all linear, and every cell in the spreadsheet is in the right order. But most of the people I know about, their life is not linear. It kind of goes this way, then something else happens, and you end up over this way. It's kind of like riding in a boat on a choppy sea. You think you know where you're going, and you got a direction, but all of a sudden you get another little boost this way, and you have to make some adjustments with God's help. And I think Moses could see that. He knew what the plan was. He knew what God wanted to accomplish, and he was willing to do God's will. But as they encountered some different things, I think he was wise enough and faithful enough to God to say, okay, God, we got to make an adjustment in our course here. We're still going to get to the promised land, but this has come up and it's a big deal. And guide me, help me. Let's work on this thing and make sure we're going in the right direction. But I just wanted to point this out because these people were God's people. And God chose them, and God provided a way, and yet they weren't perfect. Yes, sir.
I think I've said this before, but God uses unique people, I think, to accomplish his ends at times. So he had Moses leading the people, and Moses was married, and he had a father-in-law who came and joined them, I guess, long enough at least to give him some advice on how to hand out orders to the people to make sure that they received them and so forth. And now you've got the harlot in the next few slides, I'm sure, that is one that God uses because her faith in what the spies were telling them. So it's not always Jewish people or Christian people, so to speak, that comes up with the best ideas, but it's up to us, I think, to recognize them and utilize them in a proper way.
Right, and Moses' father-in-law really gave him a good idea of how to organize the people and organize it so they could get the job done. And the tribe did it by tribes and so forth, so you're right. So we got this group that went through the Red Sea. They're God's chosen. They're heading towards the Promised Land. In Exodus 14, I'd like to go back there just for a second and read what it says about them as they saw this great miracle and saw where they were heading. Exodus 14, verse 31. And it says here, wait a minute. Uh, 31. And when the Israelites saw the great power the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. So after they saw that miracle of the parting of the Red Sea and they survived and were on their way and so forth, they had a lot of trust in God, and their faith was in God, and they trusted God's man to lead them. It's only later that trust and that faith wavered. And so I guess without trying to point a finger at them, we need to take heed lest we end up like them and our faith wavers and we kind of lose the sight in the direction we need to go. And I think they were human and we're human. But yet, in Hebrews 11, it talks about these people in the hall of faith. Mentioned them specifically. That's pretty big. Let's move ahead here. My machine's working. Conquering Jericho. If we look at Joshua, this is where we find that story in Joshua 5. If you've got your Bibles handy, we can run over there. And I wanted to just check something here because as I looked at this again, they were coming into a land that had all kinds of people of different, we'll just say nationalities. And they worshiped different gods, and they'd lived there for a long time. And they had fortified cities, and they had standing armies. And they were well entrenched in this promised land. And in comes this ragtag bunch of immigrants, we'll call them, who'd been slaves all those years and had been out in the desert, and God kind of worked it out so that only those who were below 20 who wandered through there was the new group. The others had died in the desert. And so he comes in there, and God tells them, now you can take Jericho. Not a problem. Now what I want you to do, I want you to get everybody out there. I want you to select the ones to have the trumpets, and I want you to walk around the city. And it was a walled city, a fortified city with high walls, thick walls, everybody in there. And I want you to walk in there, and you're going to conquer that city. Now, Shaq, you have had some experience with military, as I understand. In your best judgment, as a military man, would this plan be something that would be recommended by the Joint Chiefs of Staff?
No. And it would probably take 5 years to get it staffed.
My mic man let me down there. He said the answer was no, the Joint Chiefs of Staff would not recommend this battle plan. And number two, it would take 5 years to get it ready. I think you're rather optimistic. Let me tell you about, well, I won't tell you now, but the one day I encountered the U.S. military. It was one day. I still remember it. I'll tell you about it sometime. And most of us would say, God, can we reconsider this? This is a fortified city. These people have been here for years and years and years. They've got a big army, and you want us to walk around there for 7 days and so forth. And we need to take another look at this plan. Now, they were not equipped as an army either. My sense of this group. Did they have some weapons? Probably. But they were not a trained army. They probably didn't have all the weapons they wanted and so forth. And God is giving them his instruction. And so you just have to start wondering here, is this really what we want to do or not? Let's look into chapter 6 for just a minute. If we look at the scriptures there, it says, when Joshua had spoken to the people, I'm down in verse 8. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The armed guards marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time the trumpets were sounding. That was their weapons, trumpets. And some of you have probably played trumpets, and if you did, you probably didn't think of it as a weapon. And it's a nice instrument, but it's not a weapon. But Joshua had commanded the people, do not give a war cry, do not raise your voices. So they're walking around silently. Do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout, then shout. So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling at once. Then the people returned to camp and spent the night there, and so forth and so on. And then, as you know, on the 7th day they got up at daybreak, marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the people, shout, for the Lord is giving you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. But keep away from the devoted things so that you will not bring about your own destruction, and so forth. It's on down, verse 20. When the trumpet sounded, the people shouted at the sound of the trumpet. When the people gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed, so that every man charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, donkeys. It's interesting, the walls collapsed and the people ran in. So they collapsed in. So they didn't have to have the walls fall on them. God said, they're going to fall in, you just climb over it and go in and take the city. That would be a moment, I think, where you'd probably feel like, yes, this is the God I want to serve. In spite of the illogical battle plan, the shouting, the trumpets, the marching around. I wondered what the folks in that city thought as they saw these people doing this. Laughing, ridiculing them. Look at those crazy people. We have a walled city. We have an army. We could throw something over and kill them if we wanted to, but let's watch the show, because this is the best show we've seen for a long time. And it's just folly. It's crazy. But I wonder what they thought when the walls collapsed. I don't know. But again, God's power. And God's power works really well when his people are faithful. And maybe that's a lesson for us. We don't have a lot of power. At least I don't feel like I do. But if I'm trying to do God's will, we have power, don't we? We can see good things happening. We can see God's will happening. Can you imagine in this area in which we live, this part of Pasco County, if we continue to do God's will as best we can, I'm talking about each one of us doing what we can and doing what God wants us to do, can you imagine the power that He's going to use to bring about what He wants? It's amazing. It really is. And I think we need to keep thinking about that, because just like He used the people to do something that seemed foolish to conquer this inconquerable city, I think He can do that for us today. I think that power is still, God's the same God. He's just got a different cast. We're the cast now, not those people. So let's move on here, and let's talk about rehab for just a few minutes here. And I think it's interesting when you look at Joshua chapter 2, we'll back up a couple pages here, that it's a prostitute that comes into God's plan here. Again, if you were looking for somebody that's going to help you do God's will, there's probably certain people that you and I wouldn't think of first. And this lady did something that caused God's plan to move forward. What did she do? I need my mic man to help me here. What did Rahab do that allowed God's plan to work? Let's get that back again.
Who was that?
She gave shelter to the spies.
Yes, she did. That was her thing she did. And I wonder how surprised the spies were. They've entered the city. They're in enemy territory. They don't know much about the city. They've just gotten there. And I would be a little worried. I'd be a lot worried. And so here's this, could we say a lady of the evening or whatever, who says to them, hey, come on, I'll take care of you. Now, I would say I would have to think about that. Is this lady really going to help me? And what kind of help can she give me? And I would suspect, being good Jewish boys that they were, they're thinking, I'm not sure I'm supposed to associate with this kind of person. You know what I'm saying? But yet she makes this offer to help them, and they're in a tough spot. Jerry.
I think if I was one of the spies, I was wonder why. Why is she going to do this? What's her motive?
See, he is the kind of guy that he doesn't trust that person. Okay, what's in it for you? Why are you doing it? Are you going to turn us over to the authorities? And when the police, the Jericho police come, they'll take us into custody, and you get a reward because you turned in these aliens. So are you using us and so forth? Yes, sir.
I think women sometimes get a bad rap because of, it takes both sides to conduct such things as we're talking about. And she probably, she was showing her goodness towards the people that were strangers there, and actually protected them from being found. And God ended up repaying her for that, if you will.
It's interesting as you read this story. This was probably one of the most unlikely people to help the Israelites. She was a pagan. She was not an Israelite. She was a prostitute. She didn't know these people. She knew they were coming to attack, I'm sure, like everybody in the city. But if you would say, okay, who's going to save the day? She wouldn't be on the top of your list, would she? Comment in the very back.
When I think about Rahab's
Just a minute. Let him get you the mic. Hold it up real close.
We have to consider Rahab's position. So she's in fact a prostitute. So if anybody's going to know the new men in town, it would be her, right?
Okay, yeah,
And
probably.
with her being a prostitute, she's not the most famous person of town. So if she had any chance of redemption and any chance to kind of, to make it to the promised land or to, redeem herself in any way, it would be to save these men who were come to take over the city where she's not the most popular. So definitely, I think there was something in it for her.
Yep. You raised some good points there. She wasn't the most popular person in town in terms of status. She was probably low in status. She may have perceived that this group that's coming in, they may be able to take over. Which side am I going to be on here? And she may have been the kind of person that rooted for the little guy. I don't know. We don't know much about her personality. We just know who she was, what she did. Yes, sir.
I hope I'm not stealing your thunder here, but we all who've studied this know that she is in the lineage of Christ.
We're going to get to that.
Yes, sir.
Hang on to that. We're going to get there. So she hides the spies at risk to her own life. She helps them to leave the city so they can get away and so they can report back what they found about the city itself. Major player in this story. God used her to help his plan move along. And it wouldn't be somebody that we would ordinarily think would be the one. But let's look on down to Joshua chapter 6, just so we can kind of get this wrapped up. Now I've got a couple questions I want us to look at. If you look at Joshua chapter 6, they come in and they destroy they defeat them. They destroy the town. But you get down to verses 22 and 23. Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house, bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her." So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother and brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. They made good on the promise. You helped us, we're going to help you. And they destroyed everybody else and all the animals. And yet, here is someone of ill repute who becomes a servant of God and helps God plan to succeed. Amazing when you think about that. Hidden, we've talked about that. Her family and her were spared. And as I looked at the lineage in Matthew 1, and you can go back and look at that, and that gospel traces the lineage. If I counted it right, and I did it 3 times, so I think I'm pretty close, she would have been the great grandmother of David, and she was in the lineage of Christ. Now, she's not the only non-Jewish person in the lineage of Christ, but we haven't got time to look at that. But who would have thought? Makes you wonder, doesn't it? But it's part of God's plan. Let's move ahead. We got just a few minutes left, and I just want you to consider some things. Is it wrong if your faith wavers? Have you ever had a situation in your life where all of a sudden maybe your faith was wavering in God, and maybe you weren't sure? Hang on, he's bringing the mic. Okay. And you got to hold it close.
Thank you. I was looking, but I can't find the scripture, and you probably know it if I'm correct in this. Doesn't it say in scripture that the ways of God seem like folly to men, or something?
You're bringing up a good scripture. I can't quote where that is, but his ways are higher than our ways, and our ways that we can't always understand, or something like that. That's a good paraphrase.
Something along that. I thought the word folly was in there. And
could be.
Men just don't understand what God can do and what he does. And it just seems like everything that he said to do was folly. And yet God had a plan from the very beginning, crossing the Red Sea.
Yep.
And everything that he did looked like folly to these Jews, going into the land and defeating giants. And they rallied against him.
They did.
And
Complained.
then with the marching around looking like, I'm going to say this, looking like fools, blowing trumpets and everything. And how is this going to defeat a walled city? It looked like folly to men, but it was God's plan to show how he could make things happen in such a foolish looking way.
God's ways are smarter than man's ways. Let's look at the last two questions that you can take home and think about. Can adversity strengthen your faith? We're all going to face adversity, and we can face it in a lot of different ways, but could we use it to strengthen our faith if we put more faith in God and put more trust in God so that we could do that? And keep your faith and walk in the light as he is in the light. 1 John 1:7. That's where we're going to be okay, as long as we are walking in the light and trusting. And there's a lot of people that didn't think God was on the right track. Jonah said, God, you can't save those people in Nineveh. They're wicked. And I'm going to show you that you can't, because I'm going the other way. And there was others who questioned, but we need to be careful questioning God. We're out of time, and we'll have to end it here. Thank you for your comments and your thoughts, and you'll have one of your regular teachers back next week, we think. Okay?